That's fine. Yeah. That's okay. Yeah, thanks.
They want to see the slide deck online.
Yeah.
That's probably gonna be more useful and
Okay, someone on Zoom, and then they have to confirm that you can see our screen and also hear us. Microchips. No. Oh, yeah. Yes. Yes. Thank you. Harshi, can you hear us?
Hi. We can hear.
Okay. Kishore, can you hear us? You were on Zoom. I think we could hear you, that's why. Okay, thanks. We'll start in a few more minutes, just for people to.
Okay, cool.
Thank you. Yeah. That would you. I like how he's actually doing an experiment. Right? Yeah.
Hey, Sri.
Hey, yes.
Actually, we are hearing some disturbances.
Okay, maybe I'll switch off the ceiling mic, but that just means you won't be able to hear audience questions. But
If there's any, I can repeat.
Can you mute all other mics except speaker?
How about now? Is it okay?
Yeah, now it's fine.
So, you can get.
All right, excellent.
Thank you all for being here, and it's a great pleasure to welcome Dr. Paul Rainey. He truly knows the ins and outs of career development because I've met him before, and we've had a couple of talks, and is one of the major things that I really benefited was the CV application packet and also negotiating a pay. And I'm glad I did that because I interviewed around, and it really helps knowing what you can ask for. Dr. Rainey has guided a lot of masters and doctoral students throughout their career journeys, including mine, since joining the Career Center in 2020. His expertise goes along beyond that. He led a lot of career service centers across different universities. He even has a background in labor relations. So when it comes to knowing the real deal about career development, I think he's the real deal. With degrees in leadership, counseling, industrial and labor relations, not to mention psychology. I think he brings a unique mix of knowledge and insight and experience. So more importantly, I think he genuinely cares for his students find their way, whether it's in academia, industry, or completely unexpected. So it's a great pleasure inviting you here, and thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you. Wow, it's kind of surreal hearing that like bio back. I'm like, oh, wow, I did that. Speaking of apologies, if you saw my picture and I had hair, I need to update my picture because I'm doing the Jeff Bezos thing now. But anyways, we're going to be talking about resumes, and specifically if you're a postdoctoral scholar, what your resume should look like if you're interested in careers in biopharm. And I use that term kind of broadly. It could be pharmaceutical company, it could be a contract research organization, it could be a contract manufacturing organization, biotech. For the most part, though, a lot of these resumes are going to have very similar looks to them, regardless of what particular type of organization you might be applying to. So with that said, did my clicker no longer decide to work here? Maybe I need to click in on this. Oh, there we go. There are copies of the resumes and the cover letter that we're going to look at today. So I'll just give you a second or two if you want to grab those. And by the way, if you get some notice that you have to request permission to access it, just ask for permission. And once I get back to the office, I'll be sure to click whatever button I need to click so you can get access to the resumes that we're going to look at today. All right, well, let's get rolling here. So we're going to take a look actually at 3 particular resumes. Unfortunately, I can't create resumes for every kind of position that you might see in biopharm just because we don't have time. But we're going to look at a couple of different resumes here. The first is going to be Rudder P. Caulfield, who's a postdoc researcher with extensive bench science experience. They're going to be aiming for like a senior scientist or maybe a scientist 2 or scientist 3 position. We're also going to take a look here at Aggie J. Goodbull. So they're a postdoc scholar. They have more integrated training in life science, bioinformatics, and chemistry. Their job target is going to be protein scientist. And then we're going to look here at actually that name's kind of wrong there, so apologies with that. But they're a postdoc researcher with interest in scientific communication. They're going to be interested in medical affairs. So if you're interested in something that's a little more communicative, like medical science liaison, this might be a really good model to kind of look at. So with that said, let's dive into the material that we're going to talk about today. One thing that I always say when it comes to creating a resume is that content drives design. A lot of times I'll work with an advisee and they are like, okay, just give me the template. But really, you want to be thinking about the career story that you want to talk about first. And that's really what's going to drive how you decide to create that particular resume. Because as you see, all 3 of those, just from a design standpoint, look very different. However, there's some fundamental aspects and some fundamental principles that come with designing a resume. And these are just general design principles altogether. So first things first, when it comes to your resume, typically your margins are going to be between 1 inch and 1/2 inch. So I'm from the US, so I talk in terms of inches. Apologies for that if that's not the system that you use. But probably for most of you, you want to stick with 1/2 inch because you may not have necessarily enough room on the page to tell your story with a full inch. Generally, when it comes to font and typography, your body font's probably going to be between 10 and 12 points, and your general font, just as a, I guess, rule of thumb, serif font's going to be more readable, and sans serif font's going to be more modern. I can talk a lot about typography. It's something I really enjoy when it comes to design. But just if you don't want to dive that deep in there, you can just use those rules of thumb when it comes to serif versus non-serif. Now, good design is CRAP. And when I say CRAP, it's actually an acronym. It stands for contrast, repetition, alignment, and proximity. So these are just kind of like fundamental things to keep in mind. And this goes for really designing anything, like designing a flyer, designing a UI or a website, if you follow these principles here. Contrast just basically means that if we have an element on the page, we might want it to stand out. So we add some sort of formatting to it to make it stand out. In this case, we have bold. But most of our content here is not bold. We have intentionally used large font there for our name, but most of our font is normal size. Now, repetition works in tandem with contrast. That just basically means that when we add some sort of formatting to an element, we want to be consistent with adding that format to all of the elements throughout the document right there. So if we apply bold and normal typeface to one section header, then we're going to apply that same rule to all of the headers on the document. Alignment just basically means that on your page, you have an invisible grid that's going down through it. Now, you can actually turn on a grid if that helps you on Word. I don't know if Google Docs has it or not, but Word definitely does. So we have this really nice left aligned margin right there. And we also have everything nice and lined up on the right margin as well. If you decide that you're going to put content on the right, like dates or locations on there, one thing I recommend is using right aligned tab stops. It's kind of a lost art a little bit. I learned this back in high school, but you can add a right aligned tab stop that makes sure that everything is nice and lined up right there on the right, rather than spacing it over. And then we want to make sure any other elements, in this case, like bullet points, are nice and lined up the whole way down through the document as well. This helps with reading the document. The first person who's usually going to read the resume is a talent acquisition professional. And there are actually a lot of talent acquisition professionals, recruiters who have life science backgrounds. They specialize in it, but they want to be able to pick up the document and find what they're looking for as quickly as possible. And having something that's lined up is going to be very helpful with that. Now, when it comes to centering, centering is kind of like a very strong formatting choice, so use it judiciously. In this case, we've centered our name. We could even right align our name if we want to give it a little bit of a modern look. But sometimes you can center skills and competencies, and sometimes you can center even education. It looks good, but we probably don't want to center our bullet points in our substantial content on the document. And then finally, with proximity, that just basically means that similar information is kept near other similar information. Now, this is a rule sometimes we will break a little bit, but just as a rule of thumb, usually similar information is close to similar information. And dissimilar information, in this case, our executive summary and our selected publications are actually in two very different areas here on the document. Now, something real quick here, and we're not going to get like deep into like HR knowledge or anything like that, but I just want you to understand this, conceptualize it, and how certain information on the page shows up. Is you can kind of think about your responsibilities and your work streams in kind of like three categories here. So one is responsibility, which are the day-to-day duties, level of oversights, and purview over work. And that can be other possible employees as well. So if you are supervising graduate assistants, for example, or lab technicians, or anyone else that kind of comes under your supervisory purview, then that's something that you probably want to put on the resume. Judgment is authority level and ability to make independent decisions. So, when you were grad students, you might have been, you might have had closer supervision from your PI. Now your postdocs might be leading your own research projects, whether they're part of your PI's research project or they're your own research projects. So you have a lot of ability to kind of make independent judgments and make decisions then. So you want the resume to reflect that as well. And then impact is influence on meaningful organizational decisions. So organization could also be your research group. It could be the medical school itself. It could be Texas A&M University. There's different ways we can kind of look at the organization, but we'll see how all three of these kind of pop up on the page as we go through our presentation here today. Now, what I have up here We're going to start kind of with the job description. We're not going to spend a ton of time on this because we could probably spend a half hour talking about this, but I do think it's important that we look at a job description so you get a little idea of like how to read it and how certain information might pop up on the resume. So I pulled up a clinical research associate position here at MedPace. MedPace is a CRO or a contract research organization. They're the ones who, if like a large pharmaceutical company or a small pharmaceutical company doesn't necessarily want to manage their own clinical trials, they'll work with a CRO to kind of manage that. So CRAs manage clinical trial sites here. So let's read a little bit of the job description. Now, there's two types of qualifications here. There's what we call required, and then there are preferred qualifications. So required, or sometimes known as basic qualifications or minimum qualifications, are non-negotiable and must be communicated on the resume page. So in this regard, like education level or the degree that you may have would be considered a basic qualification. So like health or life science related field, a lot of times they'll use like non-specific language like that in a job listing, just because like sometimes degrees can get like super like you know, nuance, like the difference between microbiology and molecular biology, you know, like they want to kind of cast the widest net possible. And a lot of times when it comes to these life science positions, they don't parse like the differences like that. They're like, you know, it can be microbiology or molecular biology or biomedical engineering or medical science. Like a lot of times they don't. Sometimes you'll see positions where they're specifically looking for chemists or material scientists, but for the most part, if it's a life science degree, you're golden on that. Preferred qualifications, in contrast, are nice to have qualifications. So while you don't need to have the preferred qualifications, usually you're going to be more competitive if you do, and you want to communicate those again on the resume page. A lot of times they'll increase your initial starting salary if hired, so we don't really have time to get into like salary ranges and how that's constructed, but usually there's a range. Most people are going to get hired somewhere around the middle of that, like the average candidate. But if you have more preferred qualifications, a lot of times that initial offer will come a little bit higher than what that midpoint is. And then that gives you a little more runway to negotiate as well. And this is important as well for life science or biopharma. A lot of times you'll see dual listed positions like scientist 2/scientist 3. If you have more years of experience, and a lot of times if you have certain preferred qualifications, you might be hired in at like scientist 3, or if it's the difference between like associate scientist and senior, you might be hired in at senior. At the end of the day, your job duties are the same, but like you have wider responsibility and scope a lot of times when you're hired in at a higher level position. Usually in industry, to get hired in as a principal scientist, you usually need some industry experience. Even a postdoc, it's kind of difficult to leverage that into a principal scientist position without industry experience. But at that individual contributor level, a lot of times there's wide range with those different positions. So look for specific skills in both qualifications and responsibilities here. You don't necessarily have to have every one of these bullet points on your resume, but you want to touch on as many as possible. And here's the thing is like, once you've identified like what your job target is, you don't have to keep rewriting your resume. There might be a little bit of tailoring that you do before you apply, but if you've identified that job target, so if you're like, I really want to go and become like a bench scientist in industry, that resume is going to look very similar. However, if you're interested in like covigilance, for example, that resume probably going to look a lot more different than somebody who's earlier within the drug discovery pipeline. So something to just kind of keep in mind. And you can have two job targets. You might be interested, oh, I really want to work you know, as a bench scientist, but also I'm really interested in being a clinical research associate, which is a lot more about managing research than actually being at the bench. You just want those two resumes to look a little bit different to reflect those skills. What you'll often see on a job listing are key terms, and we're going to revisit key terms a little bit later in this presentation, but these definitely should be popping up on your resume So as you can see, like they're kind of technical terms, but they're not super, super technical. They're not like the methods section of a manuscript. They don't get that technical, but like, you know, you can see some of them: protocol deviations, regulatory document review, clinical research sites. Not everyone has to like pop up on your resume, but it is important that you have some of these on your resume. I'm not going to read all of these, but like just from a life science standpoint, like here's some of those like key terms that you might want to pop up on your resume, depending on what your experience is. So we'll return to key terms a little bit later when we talk about bullet points in this presentation here. Okay, let's look at constructing the resume and why certain decisions were made on the information that we're seeing before us on these different resumes. The first thing that you probably notice here is going to be the header. Now, this is a big difference between a resume and an academic CV. So on an academic CV, you most likely have your institutional affiliation on there. You might have Texas A&M actually as your address on there. You may have your office phone number. But for an industry resume, we personalize it a little bit. We're going to use our personal address. You don't have to have your entire street address, and I recommend that you don't, just due to privacy concerns nowadays with data. But we would, you know, want like College Station, Texas, or Bryan, Texas, or wherever you're currently living, Navasota, wherever you're currently living. Personal phone number, personal email. I would just include one phone number, one email. Sometimes on an academic CV, we might have personal number, we might have office number, for example. Just pick one. We can have a LinkedIn, we can have a ResearchGate on there, or a personal website as well. I always recommend using shortened links for anything like that. So for example, like LinkedIn, by default, it gives you like an address that has a bunch of zeros and like numbers and letters in it. You can shorten that actually on LinkedIn. So go with the shortened address right there. And then next thing that we have here is an executive summary. Some job families in industry don't really use this anymore. Like for example, like marketing jobs, but for scientist roles, I would still recommend using something like this. The executive summary. It's just a brief overview of you describing your background, and we'll kind of break this down. I'll show you some of the information on here. So first thing what we have here is actually the position title that we're applying to, so senior scientist. And it's all right to use a title up here, even if you haven't held this title. You're not like inflating your current title by doing that. It's just essentially taking the place of an objective statement. So you might have learned, like even back in college, like creating an objective statement on a resume. Typically, the only time I recommend that is if you're going to a career fair. It's kind of become old hat now, but we can put like that job title we're applying to right there up at the top. And then we have our years of experience, scientists with 8+ years. So maybe we have like 8.5 years or something like that. So we just put the plus there. And then competencies. And we want to connect those to the competencies being asked for in the role right here. And include them if that's being asked for. If it's kind of general, then we don't want to appear too specialized. So we don't include those specializations and those competencies. So that's where the tailoring comes in. It's like, it's possible to kind of put your foot forth being too specialized. However, if they're looking for those specializations, or if the type of work that you would be going into does require those specializations, you can certainly go ahead and put that on there. And then we have like some accomplishments in here. Proven ability to train future scientists, evidenced by preparing 7 independent researchers. Maybe these are like grad students or undergrads that you've mentored here, because that's important as well in industry. A lot of what you've learned like in the lab, even though like the work's maybe a little bit different, it has different aims when you're in industry. A lot of the work that you do is still transferable, particularly mentoring and supervising. That's still going to be valuable in industry. And then budgets here. So even if you're not the PI like on a grant, I always recommend putting like the size of the grants and the budgets on there, because that's the language of industry in a lot of ways. Is like, what's the budget? What's the scope of the project? And this kind of helps give that scope of the project. Now, obviously, we want to be clear that maybe we're not the PI on this, but we can talk about what the project is valued at. So if using an executive summary, it must contain a unique and job or industry aligned value proposition. So it should immediately communicate that you're qualified for the role. What we don't want is kind of like an executive summary like we have up here, results-oriented scientists with experience running experiments and generating results, proven track record of successfully applying methods and computing data. Like if you have a PhD in a STEM or a life science field, like I hope that that you can do this. Like you probably want to, been successful as being a student if you didn't have that. So we don't necessarily want that right there. But let's compare these two executive summary statements right here. Proven ability to run successful experiments, very similar to what we had before. But then let's see this example, experience running end-to-end experiments with cross-functional teams and biologics in generating actionable insights in under 2 weeks. So that's also very important in industries, like how quickly can you generate actionable results? So time, a lot of times, can be a really great metric to include on your resume. Now, this is our scientific communicator resume right here. So this person's job target is a lot different. So it's medical affairs or something that's kind of similar to a medical science liaison. So we're really emphasizing the scientific communication, the marketing, the kind of like the, I guess, desktop publishing type of experiences right there. And this is a key term as well. If you want to go into medical affairs, key opinion leaders, that basically means like physicians, physician assistants, nurse practitioners, people who are going to be making decisions about like what pharmacologies, pharmacological products a clinic may be purchasing. So that's one of those key terms right there. So here we have a skills section. Now, sometimes skills sections can get like unwieldy. I've just seen them where it's like every single skill that the person has. You want to be very judicious with this as well. You want to customize it per role. So again, you can have like, a resume that has like all of the information on it, and then you can just kind of delete out what you don't necessarily need. And then here we've like categorized this. So like we just don't have like this whole list of like skills. At least we can kind of read through this and get an idea of like what are the different specific skills. So like if I want to see like, oh, protein science, this is what this person's experience has right here. And remember what I said about the job listing. So I'm going to show you the example right here. So if we go back to this job listing, we have peaks right there, and we have it in our key skills. But here's also the really important thing. Well, actually, hold on that. That's the next slide. I do want to mention this. These are competencies and these are skills. So competencies are kind of broader and they compose multiple skills. So that's one way that you can kind of think about that. So you can be like very kind of broad or you can be very narrow. And I'll just show you what that kind of looks like here out of the abstract. Let's say like quality control, like maybe you're interested in kind of working at the manufacturing side in pharma. Well, then we can kind of break that down. Good manufacturing processes, quality assurance, product safety. And then we can break that down even further. We've got documentation, we've got technical documentation, user documentation, regulatory. Over on product safety, we have like hazard identification, industrial hygiene, hazardous material, et cetera, et cetera. So this is just the way that you can kind of start thinking about your skills and your competencies and how they show up on the page. At the end of the day, when it comes to your skills are used in order to solve some sort of instrumental issue or drive some sort of workflow within an organization. So don't think necessarily about your skills as kind of existing in a vacuum, like you have a skill, so you're going to get hired for that skill. You're going to get hired for that skill because it's going to be used to solve some sort of issue or problem or drive some sort of workflow within that organization. So what I was going to say earlier is we, yes, have the skills up here in the key skills, But recruiters also want to see it in context within the bullet points there as well. So maybe not every skill is going to wind up in the bullet points, but like the big ones, the important ones, definitely should. Next, this takes us to the education section. So make it easy to find, and it shouldn't take up the amount of space that it might on your academic CV. We typically don't need to have, you know, the whole like what was our dissertation listed on there. Now, there are some people who are still interested in maybe who your PI is. You'll come across those people in industry, but for the most part, we usually don't need that information. Who was our PI in grad school, or what was our dissertation topic. Now, with that said, do what Paul says, not what Paul does. But this was a specific situation. My dissertation was actually directly related to the first job that I got out of grad school, so I did include it there. I don't include it on there anymore because it's not relevant to my current role, at least directly. But sometimes there are rules of thumb that you violate because of that reason right there. What we're going to have for our education institution name, any institution that you received a degree from. So back in grad school, if you moved institutions because maybe your PI started an institution, you followed them, I would probably just have the institution that you received your degree from. On your academic CV, that might be a little bit different, but just include any institution you received a degree from. You don't have to include an institution that you transferred from. So if you went to community college and you got an associate's degree, include that. But if you went to community college, just did your gen eds and then transferred to the four-year institution, then you don't need to include the community college on there. Graduation date, which is going to be month, year, in reverse chronology. And location, a lot of times will be included. If it's within the United States, and this is a general rule for locations elsewhere on your resume, it's going to be city, state. If it's outside of the United States, it's going to be city, country. And this is just an example if you have multiple degrees from the same institution. It's just the way that you can be a little more efficient on the page here. So let's say we got our PhD and our bachelor's degree from Stanford. Okay, let's look at the experience section. This is probably going to make up the majority of your resume. So up here, we usually have like some introductory information. And again, we want to be a little more efficient with this than maybe we might be on our academic CV. We're going to include the employer name, location, title, and dates. So while exceptions exist, like I said, you typically don't need to name drop your PI or advisor on the resume, but like if you want to like have their lab name or their research group name, you know, as part of the location on there, you can do that. And then what we have here, and this is optional, you don't have to do this. Again, it really depends on the story that you want to tell on your resume, is something called a job summary. And the reason why you might use a job summary rather than put everything in bullet points is you probably do things on the day-to-day, and you want to talk again about your scope, your level of judgment, your day-to-day responsibilities. So we might put that there in the job summary. It's a concise but information-rich description of the role that describes like primary function and scope, budget, types of projects, lab or office size right there. And then what we do is we save the bullet points then for like where we really drove like accomplishment in. So that's what we have there underneath. So we can talk about like the different work streams. So like here, led 3-month project generating 2 breakthroughs and broadly neutralizing antibodies, abilities, et cetera, et cetera. So we don't want to have like 20 bullet points, even though like a lot of times you do a lot of stuff. So like the day-to-day stuff that really describes your role can go into that job summary right there. Now we're going to return here a little bit to key terms. So remember what I said earlier about key terms. Well, we're seeing those key terms pop up right there on the page in those bullet points. So once again, we will return to key terms here in a couple slides, but first let's just talk about how to construct bullet points. So we're thinking here about bullet points. There's kind of 2 ways that you can create a bullet point. So the first is like the simple bullet point, which if you learned about this in college or grad school previously, this is probably what you learned. Most of your bullet points are probably going to still follow this simple bullet point formula. And this is what we have for just a simple bullet point. If we break it down, we have action verb, we have process or duty, or in other words, like what did you actually do, or what were you acting upon from that action verb. And then we have our impact here. Now it's nice if we can have quantitative impacts. Sometimes we just can't quantify everything, at least in a way that makes sense. But try to quantify as much as you can on the bullet or on the resume. Now we also have something extra here, and that is we have the standard measured by or against to add credibility to the impact here. So we're talking about what we did, optimize CRISPR-Cas9 editing by engineering variants, leading to 93% efficiency as measured by restriction enzyme analysis. Sorry, tripping over my words there. So somebody has an idea of like the context of how we even got this number and the measurement standard that we're using to reach that. Now, next is a complex bullet point, a little bit different structure. And because sometimes when we're doing, work, we just got to explain a little bit more that this first bullet point just cannot explain. So we start with an action verb once again, achieve, and then we'll actually put the impact on the front end there, 95% accuracy and protein identification. And then we have kind of like the main process that we did, using ELISA to, didn't mean to hit that, using ELISA to quantify expression of target protein in 100 samples. But maybe there's more context, maybe there's more, because this is part of a project and we need to describe a little bit more with this. So then we include use BLAST to identify modulus proteins for further processing here. So like the main takeaways in that first part of the bullet point, and then what were the additional context, the additional information that's very, very useful is going to be in the second part of that bullet point. Now I mentioned about quantification. You can think about quantification in two forms. It can be in terms of scope. So supported $358,000 project, taught 85-person course, led 5-stage trial, presented during bi-weekly stand-up meetings. Or it can be the actual impact, like optimized by 89%, producing 99% accuracy, generating 1,000 observation yield, reduced time to publish by 5 weeks. So once again, like even like reducing something like time, a lot of times can be a metric that we can put into our resume. So both are important though to kind of tell that story and describe your experience on the page. And this is just another way of like looking at a bullet point right here. If this kind of helps you, with like kind of the colorization right there of like how we actually design that bullet point. And we're using principal scientist rather than principal investigator, again, just because we're being a little bit industry focused here. We're just being slightly different with the terminology. Sometimes if you're looking at industry positions, it's like you want to kind of use a little bit of the language that they use without necessarily being inauthentic. So keywords are not important for applicant tracking system AI. That's kind of a myth. ATS, that's basically the portal that you apply through, that your resume, cover letter, application materials go through. There's kind of a myth that there's like a bot inside of it. There really isn't. There's some like basic keyword ranking that some of them have, but like I've never met a recruiter that actually used those. Instead, it's important for something related, which is ATS, Boolean discovery, and linking actions, job duties, and impacts here. So for the first example, if you ever heard like that, it's kind of almost a cliche right now, like we'll keep your resume on file if you don't get the job that you applied for. That's technically true. That's why your resume is scanned. It's scanned into the ATS, which becomes a keyword searchable database. That way, when the recruiter is opening up a new job requisition or they have a sourcer that's working for them, a lot of times they'll go to that ATS and do a keyword search to see like, maybe there's somebody already in the system who'd be a good fit. So even though you might not have got hired for the first position you applied to, you may get a phone call about another position that you're actually a really good fit for. So this would just be like an example of like a Boolean like string that maybe a recruiter or a sourcer would use within their ATS. And then the other reason is those key terms. There was a job designer, like maybe somebody working in compensation or an HR business partner, or somebody who did job analysis, and just determined that those key terms, whatever they represent, like a skill or like a knowledge base or something like that, is instrumental to completing the job. And those are tied to actions like the action verbs we talked about and the impacts. In other words, what they determine is instrumental to the organization in doing that work. So like if we're using like a computational biology example right here, protein folding is a process of amino acids folding into a specific 3D structure. Modeling includes techniques to represent and simulate biological systems. And you may model the process of protein folding. And then last thing, and you may do so to understand structure, function, relationship. So we have like some key terms right there, and they're kind of like not in context. But if we did something, say, like in the lab, and then we wind up with this bullet point right here, and then we can see how those key terms kind of pop up and how they're all connected. And like, it's a story we're telling. It's not like a, it's not a story with like, names in it. We're not saying I identified, we're just saying identified. But that's how that kind of, that's kind of how that plays out. Now, page length. You'll most likely need a 2-page resume to fully describe your background, training, and impact. Sometimes you can get away with a 3-page resume. If you're a postdoc, you might be able to get away with a 3-page resume for certain roles as well, if they're bench science roles. But generally, most of you are probably going to need a 2-page resume if you're going into a pharma role. And when it comes to weighing importance, you want to think about what's the most important thing. In other words, what does somebody want to know based upon picking up that resume? And that's ultimately going to be determined a lot of times by what is the job description. So usually that you want to be on that first page. The other thing is years of experience. A lot of times this will be a basic qualification as well. So do remember that when it comes to basic qualifications, it's like you need 5 years of experience in something. You want to make sure that if somebody reads down through your years of experience here, that it's going to equal out to whatever at least the minimum of the years of experience are that are required there. So here with computational biology, just want to mention we've been talking a lot about kind of like more of the bench side of things, but this resume kind of has like a little bit of a mix of both of those. So just some skills for computational roles right here. Again, I'm not going to read that all, but you can kind of get a little idea of like what are all the different skill sets right there that you would want to see on a resume. So don't list, again, this goes back to what I said earlier, but I see this a lot on like anything that's like really data heavy. Like people will list like, again, every like piece of the tech stack they know. Don't list everyone you have, especially if it's skill that's not an industry standard. So like even Python, like even though Python, a lot of people use it, you'll still see it in job descriptions, and it's still something that a recruiter is going to scan for. So like if you see something like you need Python, make sure that you have Python on there. And don't list every training algorithm or regression, particularly if you're doing anything that's like machine learning focused. Instead, list the broad skills like supervised learning and indicate the type you use, like naive Bayes and the related bullet point here. So let's talk about writing computational bullet points. Bullets should show the skill used, the process, and if possible, the quantitative impact and how it's measured. So impact may be optimization, reduction, like if you're cleaning data, or if you're munging data, it could be like reducing observations. Reduce time. If you're doing like any data engineering, for example, like you're doing anything with like ETL or something like that, and you're reducing like processing time or loading time of the data, That can be quantification, time to results. We talked about that a little bit earlier, and accuracy as well, particularly like if you're doing anything machine learning related, it's like you can talk about like the accuracy of it. So here would just be an example of like a quantitative or computational bullet point. Develop supervised learning ML algorithm for Massachusetts General Hospital colonoscopy scan data set, which included 143, and apply convolutional neural network with 82% accuracy measured by ROC curve. So that would just be an example right there. And publications and conferences, when it comes to industry, you may have a section with this, but honestly, as opposed to like an academic CV on a resume, this is a lot of times the least important part of the resume. So you can include selected publications as well. You don't have to have a list of every single publication. I'd recommend like picking your top ones or the ones that might be most aligned with what is being recruited for in that position right there. And I want to mention a couple of things here about this resume. So like I said, very different than the other ones because this is really about scientific communication here. So if we're looking at the experience, like this person's probably done like a lot of things in the lab that are going to be like really bench focused, but you know, they might have also been doing, you know, like a lot of social media and stuff like that for the lab. So that is like what we're emphasizing right here. We're emphasizing what they've done with grants, creating grant narratives. We're emphasizing the collaboration stuff that they've done with other researchers here. Even like we have one, the next to last bullet point, identify and map key opinion leaders at 3 conferences via attendance list, influence, and research alignment, leading to 2 new external collaborations for research groups. So like that's like somebody said, I'm going to a conference and like, I want to find some external researchers. So they just like looked up who's attending the conference. They're like, oh, this person, and like their research aligns with what I'm doing or what my lab's doing. That's what a medical science liaison does. So we've just taken that very transferable experience that that person's had, and we put it into a bullet point. Now, we probably wouldn't have that on like the bench science resumes that we looked at. But again, it's all about your audience. This would be really important for somebody who's going into medical affairs. And we have our teaching experience here. Now you can put teaching experience on those bench resumes as well. Usually I'd recommend on those types of resumes putting it in its own section rather than chronologically. But here we have that teaching experience as well. And so we actually have revenue here, like valued at 90,000, might be more at Cornell. I didn't actually do the math, but all you need to do to get that revenue is number of students times credit hours times tuition. Now, it's not an exact number. And, you know, we got to think about if it's a state school, is it in state versus out of state? And like some colleges charge a little bit more. It just has to be directional. We don't have to have like a precise number. We're not, you know, we're not like, you know, building a bridge here and like we need tolerances that are like within 0.0001. So that's how we can actually get like, we provided educational services valued at 90K. So that's one way you can actually get revenue elsewhere on the resume here. And then we have our leadership and volunteer experience right down here at the bottom, because once again, we have some skill sets that are going to be transferable to the type of role that we're going to be aiming for. And then finally, we'll look here at a cover letter. Probably a lot less complex than we have going on with our resumes. But generally, when it comes to a cover letter, some people, they overthink it a little bit, but really what it comes down to, you're building a bridge between you as a professional and the role that's being recruited for. Now, one thing off the bat, you're seeing is 1 page. Like in academia, you can get away with like 2-page, even 3-page cover letter. For industry, we want to be concise. We don't want to go beyond 1 page for a cover letter in industry. So we have a greeting here. Sometimes you don't know who the hiring manager actually is or who the recruiter is. If you ever run into that situation, just say, "Dear hiring manager." Totally all right to just use that greeting. You're not expected necessarily to know who the hiring manager is right there. And then we have our introduction. Again, don't overthink it too much. It's just to demonstrate our interest in the role and outline why we're qualified for the role. We're not going to do a deep dive into all of that. That's what our body is going to be for. But our introduction right here, you can kind of see I'm writing, express my enthusiastic interest in the Scientist 1 protein science position at AbbVie is advertised on LinkedIn with my extensive background in protein science, molecular biology, and biochemistry. Our body here is where essentially we make an argument as to why we are qualified for the role. What can really make the body powerful is if you can tease a few things out of the job description and say, I've done this. And what's really great about the cover letter, we probably don't do it as much in this one, but you can give a little bit of the story of those projects that maybe the resume doesn't give you the ability to do, because the resume a lot of times is very concise. As you saw, it's like a lot of bullet points. Where here, like maybe we can talk about some of the challenges that we had to overcome and show like, hey, even though we didn't get the results that we wanted, I went back to the bench and I did this, and then I was able to get the results. We probably want to talk about that in our resume. We just say what we did and what the results were. And then finally here, the closing, just reiterate our interest, invite the hiring manager to contact you for an interview. A lot of times the cover letter is not read by the recruiter. It's very rare the recruiter will actually read the cover letter. The cover letter is really more for the hiring manager. And some hiring managers really love the cover letter, and some, couldn't care less about it. So just know that, like I said, don't overthink it with the cover letter. It needs to be well written. It needs to show that you understand what you're applying to, but it's not something to agonize over for a half a day. It's something, read the job listing, ask how am I qualified for this, make the argument as to why you're qualified, and you're good to go with that cover letter. And honestly, if you're applying to similar jobs, your cover letter may not change a whole lot. So I would just save it, copy and paste, and then tailor around the edges of what's going to be different. So the key takeaways: first, identify the types of roles you want and then write your resume towards those positions. Balance your resume between role responsibilities, scope, skills, and accomplishments, and design your resume in a way that all the information is easy to scan and find. So with that said, if we have any time, I can take any questions. Yeah. You could. Yeah. Yeah. Technically, grad students are within my purview, but basically I always say if a postdoc finds me, I will not turn them away. So if you got anything you want to email me, just email it to me. Yes. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. So like where you run into a problem is like in your actual roles. If you start inflating your titles, then that can be a bad thing. But up at the top, all that title is essentially is your objective statement. So rather than saying my objective is senior scientist, you're just saying senior scientist, and then underneath you put like the actual, a summary, and then you have your actual job title further on down. Now, there are some people that say, like, if you're a postdoc, you should change your title to research scientist. I would caution against that because that could be seen as being inauthentic. So just take that with a grain of salt. But up at the top, that title, it's totally all right to use it there. Yes. No. So kind of what's going to be your job target, or at least what would aspirationally be your job target, right? Okay, so like if product development is what you're going to be interested in, what I would do is I would de-emphasize the things that probably are not going to be as related to product development, but really emphasize the things that are going to be related to product development. So for example, cross-functional work is going to be really important because a product developer, whether they're like a product manager, a product owner, or even a project manager, like a lot of that is marshaling resources, particularly even people that you don't have formal authority over. So that would be something that I would definitely like emphasize. And then bringing things to fruition is always important. So again, time is always going to be important right there as well. So like if you're able to make something happen, obviously you have any patents or anything like that, lean into that. Just don't have them like listed like on the resume. Talk about like the process that you had to go through. If you've done anything with like regulatory affairs, for example, and you're looking to go into product development in something that's biopharm, that's going to be super, super important. And then like some of the other things that you've done, maybe it's just a bullet point on your resume, or maybe it's just a short description, or maybe it even goes into another section. Now, for the most part, you want to try and stay to be chronological, but sometimes it makes sense to create another section for something that just doesn't fit within your story. A lot of times, like I said, with teaching, I'll recommend that you actually put the teaching in a different section. That way, like somebody, if they're looking for more of the science skills, can see that, then they can see the teaching skills. Like if you were a grad, a grad assistant, like in the middle or something like that, where you taught, or maybe you also have a faculty appointment or something like that. That way, people can kind of conceptually see where they're looking for things. Yeah. If it's optional, you're probably fine to just submit the resume as long as it's a strong resume. Usually the cover letter is not going to make or break your candidacy. So if you ever run anything that's optional and you're like, you know what, I really don't have time to do it, I just go with the resume. And anything that doesn't require a cover letter, don't bother writing it. Don't like try and put it on the front of the resume or anything like that. Just go and use your resume to apply. Yes. It just all depends. It depends on how you're being evaluated. It depends on what people see as valuable. If it's not super old, one thing I'd probably recommend, I would maybe even create a section for it and have that on the first page. Now, if your industry experience was, 7 years ago or something like that, maybe just put it in chronological order. But if it's relatively recent, I would maybe put it, if it's relevant to your job target, I'd maybe even put it in its own section on the first page. Yes. Yeah. So there's a little bit of nuance to this. Usually when you apply online, you'll get those 3 questions, right? The first one is, will you now or in the future need work authorization? So you just always answer that truthfully. Now, they can't technically ask you like, what's your citizen status or something like that. But there's certain ways they can maybe infer that. You can, if you want, disclose your visa status up at the top within the header. No recruiter will say, will ever say like, let me think of how to word this. No recruiter is going to officially say do that, but unofficially, it is helpful for them because that way there's no ambiguity. And sometimes it depends on the employer. So sometimes you have principal scientists within an organization that will sponsor somebody and then or hire somebody on OPT, and then there might be those who don't. So if the recruiter is thinking about who's a primary scientist or principal scientist that this person would be able to work under because their visa status, that can also be helpful with them kind of shuffling you through the organization. So you can disclose it on your resume if you want. You're just not required to. Any questions online? Any other questions? All right. Well, thank you again for inviting me.
All right, thank you again, Dr. Rainey, for giving us such a great talk. And I want to thank everyone for attending the Postdoc Association monthly seminar. Our next one is in April, but we're still finding a speaker. So stay tuned, check your email, and we'll get back to you. Thank you.
And you have a copy on the
Okay.
desk plus if you want to send it.
Perfect, thank you.
I'm also gonna
Your meeting has ended.